the theme because next Friday night is the beginning of Passover for the Jewish community. And as I mentioned before, it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, recorded religious festivals in human history. It began to be written down about 1,000 years before Jesus when King David came to the throne, and the 1,000 years of oral tradition going back to Abraham started to get written down. He had a court, he had scribes, and that's when what we call the Hebrew Scriptures began to be written. But they're based on 1,000 years before of oral tradition. And the festival of Passover really started before David. There seems to be in the oral tradition elements that it was a spring festival for farmers in Israel, going back to maybe 1200 BC, they would celebrate the first wheat, and then the shepherds would celebrate the birth of the new lambs, and so they were agricultural festivals first in thanksgiving for spring and for wheat and for meat. And then when the temple was built by Solomon, about 100 years after David, around 900 BC, then the people would come to the temple this time of the year, and they would also remember the Passover, which had occurred about 300 to 400 years before. So that's kind of the background. Now, what I would like to do this morning in putting up this map is give you a little bit of history of Judaism and explain as it evolved why it was so important in terms of its contribution to humanity. What we know from archaeology, this is the about 3,000 years BC, what we know from archaeology is that there was a very flourishing civilization here that we call Mesopotamia. This would be modern-day Syria, Iraq, Iran. But you notice in the valley, that's where the civilizations emerged. And there's evidence that archaeologists have found, digging in the sand, of a civilization that flourished about 5,000 years ago. And the scriptures, the Jewish oral tradition and then the scriptures say this is where Abraham came from. And what we know, looking at the tablets buried in the sand about the beliefs of these people at the time of Abraham were the following. They worshiped different gods, they had festivals, and they had a creation story. And some of you maybe are familiar with the creation story of the Sumerians called Enuma Elish, it's called. And in Akkadian, Enuma Elish means when on high. That was the opening words of their creation story. And the creation story went like this. When on high, the gods were in the heavens. The chief god Enki and his wife Tiamat had several children. And the children made a lot of noise as they were growing up. And Enki, the chief god, says to his wife Tiamat, keep them quiet. I want my peace. Well, the kids, being kids, made a lot of noise. And so the father then says, if they don't shut up, I will start to kill them. At which point, one of the boys, a teenager, decides he's going to get rid of the old man. And so you have deicide, you have and patricide. A son divinity kills a father divinity. And then for 6 generations, there's war in the heavens. The gods fight each other, they take sides. Tiamat, the queen, takes one side, some of her sons take the other side. 6 generations of war, and then there's a generation of peace. The 6 and 1 in Genesis builds on that. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. They're picking up from the Sumerians 6 and 1. But in the 7th generation, Marduk, who becomes the king and the god of Babylon, he wins the battle against his brothers and against his mother. And one of the first things he does is he kills his mother, and he carves up her body, declares her to be evil, and he creates the material world. And when he created the material world, he created animals and vegetables and humans. And he says to the other gods, I am now your chief god. I have won the war. And I will provide peace in the heavens and food for all you gods. Because these humans we are making are slaves of the gods. And their whole purpose is to do sacrifice of animals and grain, and when the smoke comes up to heaven, it will be transferred into food, and we can continually rest. Humans are our slaves. End of creation story. Well, you might imagine that civilization had not only religion, it had commerce, it had writing, it had poetry. You could imagine a Socrates emerging, Abraham saying, "Wait just one moment. You mean we're really slaves of the gods? That's all there is? You mean women are evil? You mean this material world is evil? Time out." So all the Jews say is that Abraham, their ancestor, heard a different voice. And the voice was, "Get out of here. Leave. And you will become a great people. And you will be a blessing to the world." That's what Genesis chapter 12 says. Abraham gets very little information except, get out of here, and something good is going to happen to you, your ancestors, your descendants, but for the whole world. But he's not told. And then the story says that he started to migrate with his family. He was at an elderly age, no children, family and relatives, animals. They migrated up this valley. And what we do know from archaeology, this valley was a trade route where people would travel up the valley and then down the coast. The Canaan coast was fertile, and then this was the next fertile civilization, the Nile. And we know from archaeology that people did make this travel routes back and forth 3,000 years ago to trade goods. The Christian scripture speaks about the Magi from the east who came, and lo and behold, they were in the region when Jesus was born. They were traders, and they were traveling back and forth. What did they have in their saddlebags? They had gold, they had wine, they had incense. They were traders, okay? So archaeology shows us that this was a trade route. And so Abraham moved along the trade routes, and he settles in the land of Canaan. And by the time he settled, this is around 2000 BC, 1800 BC, when he settles here, and his burial cave is still in Israel. Jews and Muslims both pray at the cave of Abraham because they both see him as the first monotheist. And so he's buried here, and God promises him that this land eventually be his. And then his grandchildren go into Egypt because there was a famine. We know that the rains come from the Mediterranean usually in the fall every year. And sometimes the rains are delayed. And sometimes that can cause famine. And so that would explain why some of Abraham's descendants would go here. And this was a very fertile valley, and food was always plentiful, and the Jews did very well. And as Steve started his story, the Jews were around 1700, 1500 here, doing very well. But one more thing before we get to here in the Passover. When Abraham settled here, there was also a civilization, the Canaanites. And they had a religion. They had many religions. And we're able to reconstruct through archaeology in the sand what their tablets said about their religion. And they had many gods like the Babylonians. And one very important god was the god of the rain, because that was essential every year for the crops. Because they had a long dry season and then the rain would come. So they would pray to Baal, B-A-A-L, pray to Baal. Bring us the rain, bring us the rain. And when the rain was delayed, what they would do is they would choose a female. The king would choose any female he wanted, take her up a hill, and have sex with her on the top of the hill so that Baal could see fertility, fertility, fertility. We're having fertility. You give us fertility, give us rain. And that's what came to be known as cult prostitution. In other words, having sex in a religious ceremony to bring the gods to favor, okay? And then when that didn't work, what the king would do is he would choose another female, bring her up the mountain, slit her throat, put her on a slab and say, Baal, you see how much we love you? Look, we're giving you one of our own. So human sacrifice, cult prostitution, and humans are slaves of the gods. So the Jews are getting an earful as they're moving along of stuff that's saying, is this really what we want? And remember in the story of Genesis, when Abraham takes his son up the mountain, he's going to kill, he is picking up the Canaanite traditions. He's becoming politically correct. He's assimilating. He's settling into this civilization. But then he hears the voice again, no, 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 don't do that. You know, in other words, the Jews are moving, looking for something new, hoping there's something better message for humanity, but struggling all the time in terms of the old. Okay? So then they go into Egypt and they flourish. And the story, as Steve read, said they did very well. Hardworking, had kids. And then things changed. You got a Donald Trump Pharaoh who said, out. You're finished. You're getting too uppity. And he says, we're going to get rid of you. He didn't build a wall, but he had a more effective measure. He put the word out that all the midwives were to kill the firstborn Jewish males. Because he figured we killed the males, we're not going to have any trouble of revolution for these people, and they're not going to be able to propagate. So he puts that word out. Moses is miraculously saved. The irony is he's a Jew, but he grows up an Egyptian. There's real irony going on here. And he's doing well, but he never forgets his roots, and that's why he protects a Jew when the Jew is being beaten by the Egyptian. He kills him. He's in trouble, and so he goes over here. You see, the Suez Canal was not built yet here. So this is a marshland. And in biblical times, there were tidal effects in this region with the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So there were marshland where there would be low tide, where people could slosh their way through the mud and get across here. And then there were other times when the tide was high. I'll come back to that because that explains the Egyptians drowning and the Jews getting away. But he goes over here, and he's fine. And he gets married, and he has children, and he has animals, and then he has this hierophany, this incredible sense there's something wrong. And I made it, I'm out of here, but my people are suffering. And his conscience is starting to wrestle. And the burning bush is a symbol that this God is speaking to his conscience. And he says, I've heard the cry of my people. They are suffering. So what Abraham and then Moses are beginning to sense is there's a different kind of understanding of divinity possible. And that different kind of divinity doesn't smother and sacrifice human dignity, but wants to enhance it. And so that's the words, I've heard the cry of my people. I have come down to liberate them. And Moses says, great, do it. He says, no, you're going to do it. And then it's very funny because Moses gets cold feet in the story. And he says to God, you really want me to come back there? Yeah, you go back. Talk to Pharaoh. He says, well, Aaron, my brother, is a better speaker than I am. Why don't you send him? God says, nope, you're going. So he's not sure. But he goes back. And he confronts the Pharaoh. And notice he doesn't use violence. He uses diplomacy. Non-violence. Look, just let us go. We're not going to cause you any trouble. And he says, no, you're going to stay here. So then he starts doing these signs. Well, again, geology and archaeology can help us because at different seasons of the year, there are different natural phenomena that occur. Jeff is shaking his head here. Things like gnats and flies and stuff. And probably what's going on here, Moses says, now you see these irregularities that we don't like certain times of the year, these gnats and the Nile turning red. Well, that was the silt at different times of the year. The mud would come through, particularly when there would be a tidal effect. And he says, look, that symbolizes blood. These are the blood of my people. Can't you see that the irregularities in nature that you don't like are signs of something terrible that's happening to my people? And each time Pharaoh gives in, but then changes his mind. So there's this back and forth. He tries diplomacy first. He's leading from behind, as we would say today, which is not a bad way to do things. In other words, don't lead with military force. Try to talk to your enemy reasonably. And finally, Pharaoh says, okay, but keeps changing his mind. And then the justice of this God kicks in. The compassion is there, and the compassion is there for the Jews, and the compassion is also there for the Egyptians because they're giving a chance to change. And they refuse. And then justice kicks in. A plague breaks out among the Egyptians that kills a lot of their firstborn. And the Jews are able to leave. And if you notice, the insight here is that this new concept of divinity is both compassionate for humans, but also has justice in mind for those who constantly refuse to respect the dignity of others who are suffering. And that's what kicks in. Mercy and justice. Now, how did they get out of there? There's no record in Egypt of a massive 5,000 to 8,000 people leaving. And the Jewish scripture says it was 5,000. Because this is a legend that's embellished over time. But archaeologists, in the latest issue of Biblical Archaeological Review, which I have with me, says there are historical evidence that there were some Semitic people living here at that time, around 1300 BC. They have found, they've excavated and found 4-room homes, which is exactly what the Jews built when they were in the land of Canaan. And the Egyptians didn't have that architectural design. There were references to some words in Egyptian that have very close parallels in Hebrew. So archaeologists do believe that there were Jews in Egypt. The Egyptians never wrote about them getting away because it was very embarrassing. And maybe there weren't thousands, maybe there were a few hundred, maybe there were 30, maybe there were 40. But the point was they got away. And that normally didn't happen when you were in slavery. Normally, what slaves would do is they would take the seacoast road and go right along here, which was perfect for the chariots, and the Egyptians would have chased them and caught them. But Moses is smart. He's been over here before. He knows the tidal effect in the marshes, and so he waits. He waits till low tide. And then the Jews slosh across the marshes, and then the Egyptians, following them in the marshes with their chariots, are stopped, okay? The rabbis, in commenting on this event, not only comment on the power of God that was working through Moses to free the people, but they remind the Jews in the Talmud that God wept for the Egyptian soldiers because they were his people also. What a profound insight that those rabbis had hundreds of years ago. That even their enemy, whom they had to oppose, and whom God is punishing, are also the children of God, and therefore the Jews should not gloat. They should have compassion on their enemy. Where does Jesus get all this stuff? He gets it out of Judaism. It's all there in terms of a merciful, compassionate God. But then that's not, as Paul Harvey would say, what's the rest of the story? Well, it's not all roses and ice cream. For whatever reason, they wander around here for a long time. And why, we don't know. Don't they remember the story about Abraham, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers back here? No, isn't that where they're headed? We don't know. But we do know from the oral tradition that then gets written down is they started to complain to Moses because they didn't have 3 square meals like they used to have in Egypt. They were slaves, but they had their bellies full. And so they start complaining. You know, where's the food, Moses? Did you lead us out here to die? What's going on? Who's this God you're following? And of course, Moses has to get angry with them, and he strikes the rock with a rod, and all of a sudden they find an oasis and so forth. But something else happens out here. And it's the Sinai experience. We know from archaeology that this northern area of Sinai here was, in ancient times, was volcanic. And the volcanoes now, of course, are inert. So when it describes in the book of Exodus that there was fire and smoke in the mountain, it was a volcano. But Moses senses again in that fire, in that noise, there is this spirit calling him. And he withdraws to meditate. And what happens? He is beginning to come to the realization that there's a moral law this God has. So it isn't that this God is just interested in saving the Jews. Now he's beginning to realize that there's a moral law that's being given, this is the commandments, and that the commandments are not just for the Jews. So you have the Exodus experience of freedom closely associated with Sinai, the Sinai experience, and the commandments. Now, the story says Moses gets 2 tablets, 2 parts of this law. And the first 3 commandments have to do with their Jews' relationship with God. There is one God, you honor his name, and you rest one day a week to think about God. In Egypt, they were slaves, they worked 24/7. So this insight now is that we need to rest. Work is not our God. We need rest. And if we want to understand this God that's evolving in our consciousness, we have to also take care of our rhythm of life and rest. So the Sabbath was always seen by Jews as not just a day to go to church. It was a day to celebrate life with the family, because this God wants human flourishing. But the last 7 commandments have to do with human relationships. So the Jews are expected to follow all 10. But they come to the realization, and this is in their creation story, that when God created the earth, he created male and female in his image. Genesis 1:28, and that's part of the oral tradition. And what the Jews, beginning with Moses, begin to see is that these 7 are universally embedded in the conscience of every human being. Honor your parents. Don't murder. By the way, the English translation, thou shalt not kill, is bad. The Hebrew is don't murder. There's a difference between murder and killing. Don't murder. If you are married, be faithful to your spouse. It doesn't say anything about premarital sex. It says if you're married, be faithful. Don't steal. Don't lie. And don't let lust and greed, the last 2 commandments, enter your spirit, because if you do, then you're probably going to break the commandment about faithfulness in marriage and respect for the property of others. And the insight of Moses and the Jews from then on is, these are universal in the conscience of every human being. This is what the creation story means, that the image of God is in everybody. Every human being with a conscience can know God. That's why you don't have rabbis coming to your door at Passover, knocking on your door saying, come and celebrate with us at Passover and become a Jew. It's not necessary. What they believe is this new understanding of God is not only compassionate, but has a moral law for everybody that's embedded in the human conscience, and therefore atheists, agnostics, other religions, all can know something about this God because of the laws of Moses that's embedded in the human conscience. This is a tremendous gift to the world. Tremendous gift. Because what this says is that religion should affirm the dignity of human beings, not just gods. That all human beings are sacred, and even if they have no sense of God, they have an experience of the divine if they follow their conscience and respect the sacredness and the dignity of every human being. That's profound. That's profound. And therefore, for the Jew, salvation or relationship with this God is not based on faith. For them, they're supposed to believe. That's part of their tradition. But for the non-Jew, ethics is far more important than faith. How do you live your life? How do you relate to the people who are different from you? Do you take care of people? And that's why this is so important. The other very important thing about the Jewish tradition and about Passover is it isn't just personal spiritual liberation. The emphasis in Christianity is help you save your soul. The emphasis in Buddhism is help liberate the divine peace in you so that it can return to the divine principle of Brahma. The focus in Buddhism is individual. Control your burning thirsts, your lusts, your anger to live a peaceful life. But Judaism goes a step further. Individual liberation from individual sin and limitation is not the end. You have to be concerned about social liberation. And that's what Passover is all about. They could not have a full relationship with God in captivity. They needed liberation so that their full humanity could flourish, and then they could understand this God that had been beckoning their ancestors. So you don't get spiritual or religious salvation unless it's collective. And it's collective through work for justice. That's why Bernie Sanders was invited to the Vatican last week. He knows that stuff in his bones. And Francis knows it in his bones too, because they come from the same tradition. And they will not be satisfied with salvation by faith alone, either one of them. They're concerned about the environment. And what did the Pope do right after he met Bernie? He went to Lesbos and he met the refugees, and he said to the Europeans, open your gates. Stop it. You've got to let these people in. And he took 15 of them on the plane with him back to the Vatican to settle them in Vatican City. He's what the Jews would call a mensch. A mensch. But that's what Judaism has given to the world. A tremendous sense of the sacredness of human beings and the fact that human beings have goodness in them. They don't teach original sin, they teach original goodness. And that can be activated by people if they listen to their conscience. But then it can't stop there. It has to reach out to the world. That first reading this morning by Dan Berrigan celebrates that liberation is possible. He's not just talking about individual liberation. That guy went to jail to try to stop the Vietnam War. He's talking about justice. But then Bishop Tutu says, but it ain't easy. The Jews had to wander for 40 years, and they still were stuck in Egypt in their hearts, and they had to struggle to come to an understanding of what this God was asking of them. And then the congregation, Beth El in Sudbury, Massachusetts, we can't stop here. As long as there's anybody in the world enslaved, we have to be involved. Sometime you should Google the Jewish Relief Agency, Jewish World Service. It was founded in about 1972. And Jewish World Service is a Jewish international development agency. And they don't just help Jews. They're helping the Rohingya right now in Burma. And they're out there saving their lives. And they're bringing some of them to the United States, some of them to Israel. They are out there living their Passover for other people. So the gift that they've given to the world is tremendously. And it doesn't require you to be Jewish. It doesn't require you to believe in God. It really asks you to believe in humanity. And the Jews' insight is, if you believe in humanity, that's enough. Because we believe that the God we believe in, that's all he asks. Or she asks. So I think it's, the other great thing, there's a book you want to read sometime by another friend of mine, Tom Cahill, who was in the seminary with me. And he wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews about 20 years ago, and it's in paperback. And his insight is, one of the things that happened with Passover was there's a change in human understanding of time. Up until the time of the Jews in this whole region, and you can also see it in the traditions of the tribal religions, is that time is cyclic. Things just continue to happen. And that isn't necessarily bad. But what the Jews introduce is that time also has a future, and you can change the future. You don't just repeat the cycles of the past. And particularly when it comes to human experience, you can't just repeat the cycles of the past. You have to move on and struggle for justice. And therefore, their understanding of divinity is, it's the future. The Jews do not believe in heaven in a realm apart. The Jews believe in the age to come. And the age to come is on this earth. That someday we will get it right, and people will listen to their conscience and allow the goodness that's in them flourish, and we will be able to live at peace, everybody. That's heaven for the Jew. So they don't talk about a disembodied soul that kind of wanders off with harps, and wings and so forth. They say, you go into the ground and you're sleeping. And there comes a time when it all will be reconstituted, when human beings get it right and listen to their conscience. So it's a wonderful story, and that's why Passover is so powerful. Okay? So what do you think? Yes?
Makes me really wonder how they're rationalizing this Palestine.